we get started, there is a blue BMW that is parked in the neighbor's house, just in case it's any of yours, but if not, we'll keep going. That works. Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to ACU. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Manuel Anton, a respected leader in the healthcare and the dedicated. Okay, thank you. And the dedicated leader, the president of the national president of the Agrupación Católica Universitaria. Dr. Anton attended Emory, Boston, and Harvard universities. He has served as Chief Medical Officer for Kendall Regional, Chief Medical Officer for the 14 South Florida hospitals of HCA, and the CEO of Mercy Hospital. He also sits on several non-profit boards and dedicated 7 years as the Belen Parent Advisor for the class of 2012. He's married, has 4 children, 6 grandchildren, and his wife teaches at Belen. We're grateful to have Manny with us, and we thank you all for being here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anton.
Gentlemen, it's a little warm, so I'm going to refresh. Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight or today. I love seeing friends that I have across the Belen community. It's good to see you guys again. As you guys know, one of the things that Belen has been strongest in is trying to involve not just the children, the kids, in the development of their faith and character and so on, but also involve the family, and particularly the fathers. And this is one of those efforts that has been with us, and actually one of our members was reminding me that it started in 2019, the first time we did this. Today, and as is our custom, we will have a brief presentation related to a topic that has to do with our sons and ourselves. The topic today, I don't know if you guys saw the announcement, and by the way, if my voice trails off, let me know, because I like to walk away from the speaker sometimes. The topic today is the assault on masculinity. And I'm going to be making the argument that this assault has some interesting and strange foundations that have led to where we are today, and that it is a pariah in our society. It has become a pariah. And I'm also going to argue that while we may be old enough not to have been subjected to the real effects of this philosophical change in society, our sons are being exposed to it and washed by it constantly. And so I think it's important for us to understand where it came from, what it is, and what the myths are associated with this assault on masculinity and the development of the term that's very popular in society today, which is toxic masculinity. Which has been extended from a few behaviors to the entirety of manhood. Okay? All right, so we'll begin. Rodolfo, we're going to need a screen. So give me a minute to get there. So let me tell you about the outline, because the outline is just to give you an example of what we're going to go through. And again, this is a brief presentation on a topic on which there have been 50 books written. So if anybody is deeply interested in the roots of this and the effects of this and how it became popular in our society, we can recommend a host of books. We won't be going into those levels of detail. On the subject I'm going to tell you about from the outline, it's 1 slide per subject, right? So it's going to be short. So we begin with where did the assault begin, the beginning of the assault. And we'll talk a little bit about where that came from and how, unfortunately, it actually developed originally with men as opposed to feminism, which is what sort of took over the concept. Then we'll talk about the rise of radical feminism. We'll talk a little bit about what men's studies were and where they came from. the rise of the concept of toxic masculinity, the competing ideas in society today related to masculinity and what it means and how it impacts society, the radical feminist view of masculinity and how they hijack that, what traditional masculinity is, what that represents, what character traits it represents. And then we're going to talk a little bit about traditional masculinity and how it displays itself in society. What are the effects of traditional masculinity? What do we know about it? What's the reality, as opposed to the mumbo jumbo that we hear in the newspapers and the articles and so on. And then we'll finish with the myth of male toxicity. Okay, so that's not a male studies. It looks interesting, but mayhem and requiem. Okay, that may tie. Okay, I have a stick. Do you need a stick? A USB? I know you have the PowerPoint presentation, right? Children are important. We will be talking a little bit about children. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start. We'll catch up later as far as the PowerPoint's concerned. So, masculinity has been under assault in our society now for probably 100 years. One could argue that the world changed in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, and men who used to be predominantly involved in construction, agrarian concerns, and so on and so forth, through industrialization basically moved to the cities and began to work in factories and so on. Offices and factories basically became the world that Western man lived in. And I'm going to be talking mostly here, when I talk about man, when I talk about society, I'm talking mostly about Western society. As you probably know, Eastern society and Southern society has changed much less than Western society. And all of these bizarre concepts that arise in our society tend to come from the West, right? The educated West, so to speak. So we moved from farm and craft into office and factory work. At that time, intellectuals, it's interesting, the intellectuals are always the ones that bring these ideas forward, began to think that men were going soft, right? Because these men who used to hunt, tear down the trees and so on and so forth, or plow the land, were now sitting in offices, and they said, oh, men are becoming soft. So men themselves, these intellectuals, began to promote a renaissance of the agrarian man. This was about the middle of the 1900s. We have to get back to our roots. Men are losing connection with their masculinity because they don't get to practice it and so on and so forth. And they began to invent this sort of this mumbo jumbo thing of men should go out into the woods and live for 2 days off the land, and you should buy a little farm and work on your farm on the weekends when you're not in your office, and that became sort of the recipe to fix man. This led to movements emphasizing toughness, military service, athletics, competition, manliness, etc., etc. I apologize, we're having some trouble there with the overhead. Okay, I'm going to keep going. The rise of radical feminism is what came after these intellectuals on the men's side. By the way, these were men's intellectuals that were saying, oh, men need to be more masculine. Well, after World War II, there was still a focus on the man as the provider, right? The head of household, the provider, the husband, the disciplined family leader, and so on and so forth was still intact after World War II. But by the 60s, there began a transformation particularly led by sort of what we call today the radical feminist movement. At that time, it was just the feminist movement. The feminist movement began to argue that men had too much power, that men were controlling the world, they were not giving them liberty to express themselves, etc., etc. And they began to challenge gender roles, which was probably the biggest thing that began to happen in the 60s and the early 70s. What were the gender roles? Motherhood, child rearing, etc., etc. And basically the feminists were saying, we don't want to do this anymore, we want to liberate women from these traditional roles and put men in those roles and have women run the companies and run the army, as an example. One of the things that was interesting is that as the feminists began this movement, it began to intersect a bit with the Marxist movements. And you're going to say, well, what does radical feminism have to do with Marxism? Well, there was a correlation in the common enemy, and the common enemy was the structure of Western society, right? So the Marxists were mostly worried about capitalism and about the fact that the means of production were controlled by companies and individuals as opposed to the collective and so on and so forth. But they also had this vision that women shouldn't be rearing the children. The state should be controlling the rearing of the children and should take over that role. The feminists saw that as, oh, they're going to liberate us. Right now we don't have to raise the children, the state's going to raise the children, and I can do whatever I want, and so on and so forth. Both of them were intent on undermining what we call today the nuclear family, right, which is the children being raised by their parents. And so they became allies. So just keep that in mind. In the background here are the radical feminists, not all radical feminists. Yeah, Rodolfo, can we move forward to the correct slide? Let's keep going.
Then you have yourself. And we being more practical.
There we go. Okay, so again, these two movements, both of them ultimately, and please forgive my frankness about this, my opinion is that both are based on envy, right? The Marxists wanted to control the means of production so they could control things, and the feminists wanted to end the nuclear family so they could control things, right? Somebody else is in power, I want to have that power, and so I'm going to start a movement to try to assume or control that power, or what I perceive as power, as opposed to what biblically we may have considered the roles of men and women in society. So again, they became allies. Not all feminists were Marxists, and not all Marxists are feminists either, interestingly. But the Marxists did promise women that they would be freed from their traditional roles, and so that became something of interest to them. Okay, then another thing happened. In the 1980s, so this is 60s and 70s, there's this challenge, right, between feminism and society and so on. Then in the 1980s, as we've seen with so many other topics in society, men's studies developed. Now, who was doing men's studies? There's a whole list of individuals involved in this. Some of them were men, many of them were women. Why they needed men's studies, it's an interesting question, but as you know, when you create an academic institution for the study of anything, chairs studies, it's to promote something about the chairs. Either I want different chairs, I want my chairs, I want to sell you chairs, something is going on. And so men's studies were basically started to create what I'm going to call disinformation. Disinformation began to come from these academic centers that were studying men, and of course what they were studying was the thing that the radical feminist view was, what's wrong with men? And that's what started to be produced in the literature and the advocacy groups and so on and so forth. Okay, so researchers began to argue, interestingly, that masculinity was socially shaped rather than biologically fixed. You probably still hear this argument in society today, right? That there's no difference between men and women, that all the differences between men and women are actually societally induced. It's how we educate our boys, it's how we educate our girls, that's how they're differentiated. There is no difference between men and women. Even people are arguing that physically there are no differences between men and women. Obviously, the science tells us otherwise, right? So, I mean, this has been a very interesting development because everything that we interpret and perceive and observe tells us that there are dramatic differences between men and women. How many of you are married or have a significant other that's a female? Most of us, right? Do any of you who have that circumstance in your life worry about the fact that your wife is just like you? I haven't seen that. I can tell you my wife is nothing like me. So this concept that men and women were the same was the most egregious, I think, affront to science and reality and truth that we've seen. As a matter of fact, and just this is an aside, related to biological differences between men and women, because obviously there are a host of them, including the physiology, childbearing, all that sort of thing. But even at the brain level, there's a huge difference in the construction of the female brain and the male brain. And so, for example, the females, there's a part of the brain that connects the two halves, the two hemispheres, right? It's called corpus callosum. Females have a very different corpus callosum. It integrates information from the two sides of the brain much, much more efficiently than man's corpus callosum. Man's brain is designed to work front to back. Women's is designed to work side to side. That side-to-side connection is one of the things that we believe enables women to multitask better. Now, I don't know your experience, but my experience is I can't multitask, and my wife can do 5 things at the same time. By the way, studies also show that there's no such thing as multitasking. It's actually microtasking, right? People are switching. Men can't switch. Men have to focus. And when they switch, they lose whatever else is going on and can only see the TV. That's why they don't hear their wife talking, right? That's a physical reality. That's a physiologic reality. It's not that we want to ignore our wives. Our brains are wired that way. One thing at a time. If the TV's on, wife is off. Okay. Women, on the other hand, because of that strength of connection across the hemisphere, are able to switch tasks, right? So they can watch TV, talk to their friends, correct their children, cook dinner, et cetera, all at the same time. And again, they're not multitasking, they're micro-switching constantly, which we can't do, or can't do as well. And by the way, everything I say today is caveated with the usual sort of, it doesn't apply to everybody. People are different. Some people are good at this, some people are good at that. Some women are very good at manual labor, and some men are very good at poems. So, please don't take this to be universal truths in everything we say. These are statistical, mostly study-demonstrated truths with some evidence to back them up. Okay, so we talked a little bit about men and women. And by the way, just to finish that thought, because I made a couple of notes about this, who's good at what? So the interhemispheric connection for females allows mental rotation, multitasking, analytical and intuitive verbal memory, and social recognition. By the way, the social recognition is the reason that when we're on our way to a party, we usually have to ask our wives, what's the name of the cousin or the guy that's going to be there, and so on and so forth, right? Because we can't remember anything. The women have much more verbal memory and social recognition. Rodolfo, we need to go back up, please. Oh, it's me? Okay, so again, this concept that masculinity is socially shaped versus biological is something that we are challenging, and we're seeing more challenges to that coming through the literature today. So then sociologists, as they began to play with this thing of that, this is societally determined, not physiologically determined, began to decide that men had constructed what they called a hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic meaning where they control the world, right? They put power structures in place because they intended to control the world and not let women control the world, and so on and so forth, as opposed to recognizing that these were organic developments, right? Men had led the armies, men had led the nations, and so on and so forth. I mean, this was kind of organic. This is not something that men got together one day in a room and decided, hey, let's put the women out and let's control the world. But the sociologists wanted to challenge, thank you. The sociologists wanted to challenge the concept that this was organic. They wanted to say that this was some sort of conspiracy that men had to control the world. And they took a term that had been introduced, toxic masculinity, had actually been introduced by men's studies, men's sociologists, who were referring to this lack of agrarian masculinity. When they talked about toxic masculinity, they talked about this is the guys in the office and so on and so forth. That became toxic, and so we need to get them out of the office to get them into the wilderness. However, the feminists and the sociologists and the advocates took that term that had been presented originally as just representing the weakness or the softness of our modern environment to use the term toxic masculinity to refer that anything that referred to traditional masculinity. And that's where that term was then hijacked by the feminists. And here, when I say feminists, remember that we're talking about academics, we're talking about journalists, we're talking about publications, and so on. And it came to refer to traditional and stereotypical norms of masculinity and manhood. So now, if you read this carefully, and this is a quote from the literature, if toxic masculinity refers to traditional and stereotypical norms of masculinity and manhood, What does that say about manhood? It's toxic. Who said that? So that concept spread like wildfire because it served certain people's interests. So all of a sudden, what was originally referring to just a number of traits became representative of an entire half of our population being toxic. And this is where the danger I was talking about earlier relates to our children, to our boys that are studying at Ballet, right? Because the expectation that boys and men must be active, aggressive, tough, daring, and so on and so forth. And I apologize, I got cut off here. Actually, I have it. And dominant. Dominant is the other one. Competitive and dominant. So that concept began to take hold in society, right? That manhood was the problem. So then we have the rise of toxic masculinity. And the concept of toxic masculinity then became men are bad. Simply put, right, when you look at most of the articles that began to be published on toxic masculinity across the United States, from all the academic centers and so on and so forth, from all these men's studies, women's studies groups and so on and so forth, was the concept that men are bad. So it wasn't that there were some toxic traits or that men needed to return to the wilderness, original thought. There are some bad behaviors that are toxic, secondary thought, and then third thought, men are just bad. And I apologize for this. This is kind of... Okay, so the term became mainstream in 2010. By the way, that concept of men are bad, what was the solution to that was most offered? Feminize them, exactly. That was exactly the solution that the world had, the Western world had for their men. You guys are bad, you guys are toxic, manhood's bad, so let's make you feminine, right? That was the solution. Feminine's so good, let's make everybody feminine, that way men won't be men and they won't cause toxic behaviors. So it was widely used to describe behaviors. I apologize, this is not working well today. Rodolfo, tenemos el iPad, porque esto no funciona.
Yeah, click the PowerPoint. Little arrow? Yeah.
If somebody knows how to do that, let me know, because it is not
Where it says
working.
PowerPoint up there?
He's got to hit up there. That's my good.
Mira, dicen que si le das al PowerPoint, entonces funciona. Okay, I'm going to keep going, guys. So, becomes mainstream in 2010s. Now we start hearing this everywhere. And this is where I'm saying that we are old enough, I think, most of us, to have escaped this concept, right? We didn't grow up in high school and college and university listening to all this garbage, but our sons are. So it was widely used to describe behaviors linked to aggression, misogyny, emotional repression, bullying, and dominance. So media and activists, and the study centers, academia, etc., increasingly began to examine as part of their studies male power, workplace behavior, sexual misconduct, etc., etc. And so basically the concept became men are bad instead of some men or some behaviors are bad, right? They generalized this to the entirety of manhood. Now imagine growing up with these concepts being constantly repeated in all the different medias and so on and so forth, and you're a 20-year-old guy, what are you thinking about yourself, right? What does society think of me and so on and so forth? And that's where we begin to see the disillusionment of modern man, of modern young men, right? Basically society's against them. So then we get to the point of what are we dealing with in the competing views in society of manhood? And here I'm going to make the argument that there's sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we start with the good. Traditional masculinity is necessary for social stability and male purpose, and there is a current of belief that understands that and is promoting it. Then the bad. Masculinity itself is not harmful, but certain behaviors are. So there's some bad in masculinity. Then the ugly. Modern society increasingly treats masculinity negatively as a whole, regardless of behavior. Masculinity as a whole. And then we come back to the good, saying healthy masculinity can include a lot of positive traits. And what are those traits? And we'll be talking about the traits in a minute. But strength, discipline, protection, integrity, emotional intelligence, responsibility, all of those things are characteristics of men that we carry into our families, into our society, into our workplace, and so on. So, good, bad, and ugly. Then we come to the radical. Can we advance it a little bit? Is it working?
It's lagging.
Lagging, okay. So the next concept is the radical feminist view. Now, what did the radical feminists try to leverage against masculinity and against men? The worst of the behaviors is what I'm going to call the ugly, because they focused on the ugly and promoted it as representative of men. And what are those? Domestic violence, sexual violence, bullying, the war culture, male mental health problems, difficulty forming emotionally healthy relationships, and the dominant culture and perceived oppression of women. So here, basically, the radical feminists took all the worst things that any man could have done, and that some men do, and we know that. We know that there are some men that have bad behaviors. They took that and they made that representative manhood. And so that's what our children are being taught. That's what our boys are being taught. And by the way, that's what our girls are being taught. So imagine the boys are having their confidence undermined and their self-perception undermined. And what are the women having? The girls. The girls are having this perception that men are bullies, evil, rapists, etc., and that they shouldn't get married, and that they shouldn't have children, and that they should abandon the traditional lifestyle, right? So this has been damaging not only to the boys but also to the girls, giving them a stilted worldview. Okay, let's talk about traditional masculinity, and here's sort of the good. What do we know about men in general? And guys, again, this is a sort of a generalization, right? I mean, I don't have all these traits, I'm sure you don't either, but most men collectively carry some element of these traits. Courage, self-reliance, provider mindset, resilience and decisiveness, family and community protection inclinations, action-oriented leadership, rational, patient and disciplined responses, loyalty and integrity. So those are some of the characteristics that we believe men generally carry, particularly collectively. Individually, we may be missing one or two, but collectively we generally represent these characteristics. So what impact do men that have these characteristics have on society? What's the objective information that we know, despite all of this negativity against men and against masculinity? What do we know? How do we know? What do we know about men impacting society, and particularly children, right? Which is why we're all here. Hormones, what's that? What about hormones? Role models, yes. So yes, a lot of what you're going to hear now is related to whether men make good role models for their children. And so what do the studies show? And a couple of you that I've talked to before, for example, at the Belen Holy Smokes, I've heard some of these statistics. I'm going to run through them, but hopefully they'll still going slow.
You can use it. You can use it.
Okay, so press the PowerPoint.
PowerPoint.
No, he said.
Just scroll. I think you need to scroll.
Let me do it.
No, it doesn't scroll.
Let me do it.
Okay. So, involved fathers and families, what impact do they have? Are they bad for families? Do they destroy their children? Do they damage society, etc.? Well, the studies don't seem to indicate that. Academic achievement is 43% more likely among involved fathers' families than when they don't have involved fathers. By the way, that's 43% more likely to earn mostly A's. Behavioral issues, reduced likelihood of behavioral issues, including aggressive behavior and delinquency as reported by officials. Without a father figure, 2 to 3 times more likely to exhibit behavioral issues and delinquency. 2 to 3 times worse if the father's not involved. Emotional health, 30% more likely to have high self-esteem, lower levels of depression and anxiety by 30%. So a father being involved in the family lowers depression and anxiety by 30%. Social skills, 60% more likely to show positive social behaviors, decrease in risky behaviors during adolescence. 60% reduction in risky behaviors in adolescence if the father's involved. So much for toxicity, right? Educational aspirations, 2.5 times more likely to achieve higher education levels and pursue post-secondary education, going to college. Relationship skills, enhance child's ability to form healthy relationships, and statistics show that girls with involved fathers are less likely to engage in early sexual activity. So, we have a myth. Society, as we know it, has created a myth, which has been very destructive, I believe, to men, particularly to young men and to young women. So, how do we address the issue of the myth of male toxicity? So, what I'm going to tell you now are those things that are statistically associated with children who have fathers involved in their lives. This is statistic. Better emotional control, higher confidence, lower rates of teen pregnancy, lower rates of incarceration, better long-term employment stability, better socialization, better boundary setting, better discipline, better risk management, and better emotional resilience, meaning that they don't bend or break when they're put under pressure either at school or at work. So, I think the evidence, the studies, would demonstrate that toxic masculinity is a myth. It's a concept that has been created in order to try to empower people who want or have issues. It does not represent the reality of the impact of men in their families. It doesn't recognize the incredible contributions that men and fathers make. Another element, and by the way, this one's somewhat controversial, but I will put it out there and you can research it for yourself, but there is evidence that if you take single mother families, single father families, and mother and father families, which ones do you think do the best in rearing children and avoiding problems?
Mom and dad.
Mom and dad. There's no doubt about it, mom and dad. The stability, the comfort, and so on and so forth, mom and dad is best. Now, leave mom and dad alone because that is the ultimate, right? The best we can do. It's not always possible. Let's go to what sometimes happens. Single mother, single father. What group, the single fathers and the single mothers, do you believe have the closest outcome to the joint family? Single father. The studies demonstrate that single fathers do better, the children of single fathers do better, much better, almost as good as dual role households compared to single women. Yes?
Does it matter if the child's a girl or a boy?
It does not.
Does a girl do better with mom?
It does not matter. All children do better. Now, by the way, there is this counter argument, which is that, because men have more money, or because they have better jobs, or because they have better education, and so on and so forth. What you're seeing is a socioeconomic result and not a gender-related result. That's the argument against this. It may be valid, it may not be, but the reality and the truth is that people or children in men's households do better than in women's households. And that's not a critique of the mothers, because remember that the best is when they're both together, which I think is a validation of the importance of the mother, as well as the father. So we'll end with the last slide, if we get to it.
Just in time.
And there it is. Let's stop there. Okay.
Can't use it, right?
Okay. No.
It's not working.
I don't have the patience. So that last slide is a quote from the Old Testament, from Kings. You guys know that King David, who was a fascinating man, if you've ever read the stories of King David, we're talking about a guy who, as a teenager, fought Goliath, who led a nation into battle numerous times, who built armies, who defended his nation, who committed sins and wept bitterly because of his sins. He repented. I mean, this is a man who wasn't afraid of enemies or of challenging himself and admitting his mistakes. I would say a man's man. King David's dying, and he's talking to his son, who will be the next great king. That's Solomon. Wisdom of Solomon, right? This is his son. So King David's on his deathbed and he's dying, and his last words to his son are, "Confortaré e restituir." Confortaré e restituir, which means take courage and be a man. And so with that, I ask you, take courage, be a man, and be the man that we need in our families to be able to produce all these results that we saw. So with that, I close. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions if anybody. Yes.
So I think about this often. I'm 42, and the expectation as a father for guys of my generation is you have to be involved. And I've never seen a level of involvement from dads like my generation has, compared to at least to my father, my grandfather. So how do you reconcile that involvement that the dads have to be? I mean, I feel like we're taking on roles that traditionally men didn't take on before. Childcare, because obviously women are working. And do you see that as sort of going hand in hand with the rise of this backlash against toxic masculinity, that now men are entering into a space that they weren't previously? The expectations are greater for men, and now all of a sudden there's this blowback about toxic masculinity and our role in that space.
So that's
you get what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great question because it brings up a paradox. And I will tell you that paradox is that on the one hand, yes, men are being asked in our current society to be more involved in child rearing, to take on more of that responsibility that women traditionally took on. Unfortunately, the structure of our society has changed significantly since World War II, such that women are less able, almost, to be involved in child rearing because of the responsibility society has put on them as a second income and as, in the workplace or liberated or whatever the case may be. It varies from family to family. On the other hand, I would argue that the post-industrialization period led to a change in fathers' involvement in child rearing that we have yet to comprehend. Why? If you look back at agrarian society, children were working at the fathers' and mothers' sides from the time they were 6 and 7 years old. So the father's in the field, the kid's right behind him, or right beside him, learning from his father from the time he's small. So that participation in rearing the children, if you will, in going hunting and in gathering and building the house and all those kinds of things that today we don't perceive because we don't do it with our children anymore, were commonplace, expected across all of humanity for the longest time. So I would say that the involvement in child rearing is a return at some level to what men always did. And if you look at the Bible, in the Old Testament, particularly the stories of the Jews and so on and so forth, you'll see that the relationship between men and sons was incredibly strong from the time that they were children. And it was the father who sort of educated the sons. So again, sort of a paradox, right? On the one hand, we're going into this involvement scenario that we find odd and where women are extricated from the family. And I believe undermining the nuclear family at the end of the day, I mean, it's hard for us to avoid it just because of the necessities of today. But the fact that moms aren't able to be moms as much as they were is a problem. The fact that means dads have to be more dads may be bad, may be good, although the results would indicate that men being involved is positive. Regardless of the cause, regardless of the outcome seems to be good. And then the paradox with history, which tells us that men were always very involved in rearing children. They weren't doing the babies, right? Men have never done the babies. We can't do the babies. But when children get to a sufficient age where they can participate in the labor of the family, it was usually the man that was instructing the children, particularly the boys.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hey, real quick, just because I've had conversations around this, and I heard me saying, I think the distinction really needs to be around the intention. In the past, men had children by their sides, but it was, you're going to follow. This, as a man, you're going to lead your family. And so while, yes, men are being called to do more and be involved more in the rearing of the child, the distinction I would say is you're not that you were saying that, you're not doing it the way a woman would do. You're doing it with intention to connect. You're doing it with intention to impart wisdom, impart lessons. Those are opportunities that in the past we wouldn't have because they would have been close to us. that now most people just exist. We're in a space, but there is no intentional teaching. This is an opportunity for you to impart. You're there with your son or your daughter, and they're at a game. They won, they lost. What did you get from this? Did you see when the referee said this or made this call? How did the coach respond? How did you respond? And these are opportunities for men to lead their families. And going back to what you were saying about the difference between a single dad versus single mom. I know the Archdiocese did a study that if only fathers took their kids to Mass, there was something like an 88% chance, 88 or 90, it was very high, that the children would follow through with the faith. If it was just the mother, it was something down between, I can't remember, it was between 40 to 50, something like that the kids would do that as adults. And if it was both parents, it was closer to like 92 to 94%. Again, showing that it's not because the father is greater, but the father holds a special place of leadership and guidance, whereas the mom does more nurturing. If my wife looks at the way like when I'm talking to my boys, when I'm talking to them, if they do something wrong, we handle it very different. And she's like, sometimes like, oh, I'm like, no, let me finish this, and then we can have a conversation because they will be more consistent when I do.
I think if you go back again to the biblical sources, right, which is by the way, our best history books right now are the Old Testament, right? They're the most complete history of a people, of relationships, and so on and so forth. You'll find that that's very much the case. Fathers are put in charge of the family. Fathers are the ones that guide the family. It's not surprising to hear that fathers that are the example to their children have, greater Mass attendance and so on and so forth. There's an old saying in Catholicism that the faith is imparted to the children by the woman. The discipline is imparted to the children by the man. And it's very telling to me, and again, I am a man of faith and I do believe what I'm going to tell you here, which is that I think God, in his ultimate design, had man, Jesus, the man, guide us in the principle of what a man could be. But he also gave us a mother to help show us what faith was like, right? What a woman could do, how that faithfulness changed the world. And yet, when you think about the father's role in the family, who is the father the role model for? God. Our children look to the father as the role model of God. This is what that masculine ultimate authority looks like to a child. And so that's where it behooves us to be disciplined, compassionate, involved, wise, et cetera, to be able to provide that role model. Because when men grow up, their vision of God oftentimes has to do with their vision of their father, who represents God in the family. That's intentional. God gave us a role model. And as a matter of fact, if you think about it, Jesus had a role model, right? God wasn't standing there by his side. It was Joseph, who taught him how to be a man. So those are aspects of that I think remind us of the importance of the father guiding the family and the mother giving compassion and care to the family. Does that more or less address that? Any other questions? All right, Nick, are you here? What's next for the guys? Thank you, gentlemen, appreciate it.
I just want to thank Father Rojas for being here with us today, and thank you all. Enjoy. Thank you. Thank you.